In our video on Dharmapala, we generally follow the lives of three interesting rulers whose lives contrast each other and shape the fate of India following the demise of the Kakota Empire. Each ruler had its own source we followed. For Emperor Amma, we followed the 1977 book called Yashovarman of Kannauj by Shyam Manohar Mishra. For King Jayapira, we followed the book called Raja Tarangini by the 12th century historian Kalhana. For Emperor Dharmapala, we followed the 1943 book called The History of Bengal Volume 1 Hindu Period, edited by Ramesh Chandra Majumdar. The chronology of when and how these characters interacted with each other is quite messy, as each source focuses on their respective character, as will be mentioned throughout this video. Unfortunately, we were unable to find the full English translations of the works of the early Jain scholars who provide further depth to the stories of Amma and Dharmapala, though they are filled with myths and legends. We were, however, able to access some English translated excerpts of these works. These sources include the Bappa Bhati Suricharita by Manikya Suri and Prabandhakosa by Raja Sekhara. In the video, we mentioned that Amma ascends the throne as a vassal of Lalitaditya. This is likely true considering that his father, Yashovarman, was a vassal of Lalitaditya. However, it is unclear when this man declared independence, though it must have been at some point considering the actions he took, including invading the province of Madra. As canvassed earlier, the story of how Lalitaditya instructed his ministers to prepare his grandson Jayapira for rulership is found within the Raja Tarangini by Kalhana. This source really delves into telling an interesting story. However, the historicity of it all is debatable when considering the events mentioned occurred about 400 years before they're written down by Kalhana. Both his sources of information and target audience would have been biased towards aggrandizing the achievements of the Kakota dynasty. For example, Kalhana provides three ways in which Lalitaditya may have passed away. 1. He was killed by an untimely fall of heavy snow. 2. He burnt himself when he felt like he was in danger. And 3, the best yet, he entered the abodes of the gods through some gate to the heavens in Uttarapata. Since it isn't mentioned anywhere, I thought the death of Lalitaditya would have been the perfect time for Amma to declare his kingship and start wrecking the people of India. It's mentioned in the Jain text that Amma wrecked Dharmapala and took his kingdom after Dharmapala's representative lost a debate with Amma's representative. This story about a debate may or may not have been true. If it is true, it wouldn't surprise me if the debate was just a method for Dharmapala to save face when in reality he already surrendered his kingdom to Amma. Like, what would they have been debating anyway, and how would they determine the winner? If it did go down, I'd imagine it going down the lines of Amma's representative saying, "Give us Bengal cause Amma's the goat," and Dharmapala's dude saying, "Yeah, okay bro." I thought the story of our next protagonist Jayapira was particularly epic, especially when it contrasts so well with that of our main protagonist Dharmapala. Jayapira had motivation and courage, only to get cracked and evil when he eventually gives up on his dreams, which Dharmapala never does despite his setbacks. Obviously, this psychological analysis and personality given to the characters comes from a review of the actions of these people in history, as depicted in the various sources, and not from sitting down and actually talking to them. According to Kalhana's account, Jayapira enters Gauda, and after a juicy sequence of events, marries the daughter of King Jayanta, who was one of 6 kings of Gauda. There is no mention of Dharmapala, which means that this must have been during a time when Dharmapala didn't have control over Gauda. The most sensible time period then seems to be after Dharmapala lost Gauda to Amma. To keep the power of Bengal kings in check, it appears Amma must have divided the province of Gauda to be ruled over by 6 different kings. Following the story, this balance of power would have been disrupted when King Jayanta consolidates power over Gauda with the help of his son-in-law Jayapira. The story continues and, in passing, mentions that Jayapira rejoins his army, then at the suggestion of his general, returns to Kashmir. On his way to Kashmir, it is narrated that Jayapira defeats the king of Kannauj and dethrones him. Amma isn't mentioned by name, but it appears that he would have been ruling over Kannauj at the time due to the chronology of everything. Nothing is said on how Jayapira, with a moderate-sized army, would have defeated Amma. This appears odd as Amma would have been ruling over the most powerful city of the most powerful northern Indian empire at the time. Neither is Jayapira ever recorded as having been the king of Kannauj, and rather that title falls onto Amma's son Duduka. Instead of an invasion of Kannauj as subtly suggested by Kalhana, what likely appears to have occurred is that Jayapira somehow defeated Amma in an open battlefield battlefield. It does not appear likely that Jayapatha directly dethroned Amma as suggested by Kalhana. Rather, it is more likely that Amma's loss against Jayapatha would have been humiliating enough to trigger him to pass his throne to Dungduka and move to the city of Gwalior. We accordingly went with the version of events where Jayapatha defeats Amma in an open battlefield and fractures his empire. This appears to have been the optimal time for Dharmapala to strike and take back Gauda, if he did indeed lose it to Amma in the first place, as was suggested by the Jain sources. In the video, we accordingly placed Dharmapala's comeback to be after Amma's demise. This would have also been a good time for Dharmapala to conquer Kamrup, a conquest which is briefly mentioned in Taranata's History of Buddhism in India. We accordingly placed this conquest here as something to foreshadow the greater conquest to come. We know that at some point Dharmapala would have built a Somapura Mahavihara, so I placed it to have been during this time to indicate Dharmapala was doing pretty good and is worth getting behind. Jayapatha's second conquest of India goes through a northern route across the Himalayan ranges instead of the traditional route of going southward. The reason for this change of behavior is not mentioned. However, considering Vatsaraja's emergence as the king of Rajasthan and Malav, it makes sense. We took these facts and considered that Jayapatha would have likely tried to avoid conflict with Vatsaraja's kingdom and instead expand his power by conquering smaller northern kingdoms. Ruling over an empire based in northern India, Jayapatha's activities would have hurt Dunduka. This would have been especially the case when Jayapatha took Madra from Dunduka and returned it to the Kakota Empire. However, none of the sources we came across directly linked Jayapatha's second conquest to its impact on Dunduka's rule. One of our sources even implies that Jayapatha may have conquered Madra from Amma. We did not consider that to be the case, noting that Jayapatha on his first conquest is mentioned to have dethroned the ruler of Kannauj and nothing is stated in relation to Madra. As such, we thought it sensible in the video to mention that Jayapatha took Madra from Dunduka, which would have triggered Dunduka's military officers to replace him with Bhoja as emperor of Kannauj. After that, nothing of substance is mentioned of Bhoja's reign or how he fell. The next person who was the king of Kannauj was likely Vajrayudha. Scholars do estimate that Bhoja's reign was short and unremarkable, so we just thought it may have been someone else's fault that his reign was like that. And who better to blame than the next guy who took power? We accordingly concluded that Vajrayudha would have overthrown Bhoja. However, the issue with this theory is that Vajrayudha's whole existence comes from an incidental reference made by the 10th century Pratihara dramatist named Raja Sekara. Still, we do know that Indrayudha and Chakrayudha likely existed, and the last part of their names indicates that an Ayudha dynasty may have ruled over Kannauj. Vajrayudha would have come before the two, so we thought it reasonable to place him as their father. Nevertheless, the relationship of the three Ayudhas is unclear if we just go by the historical sources. The next Ayudha that takes power in Kannauj is Indrayudha, who has been a pain to research as everyone seems to have an opinion on him and no one cites any convincing evidence. Some say he was working for the South Indian king Dhruva, some say he was vassalized by Vatsaraja, and some say that he allied with Dharmapala. The only historical Jain source that I found cited mentioned that Indrayudha was ruling during the time as king of the north. It doesn't even mention that he was king of Kannauj. In any case, we only found mention that Vajrayudha conquered Kannauj. Contrary-wise, we found no mention of Dhruva actually occupying Kannauj, though he does go on to defeat Vatsaraja and Dharmapala. So we figured that Indrayudha would have been vassalized by Vatsaraja, not Dhruva. We also suggested that Vatsaraja would have been the one to remove Vajrayudha and pick someone more friendly to rule in Vajrayudha's stead. However, the transition of power from Vajrayudha to Indrayudha is never explained in the sources. Though Indrayudha may have allied with Dharmapala at some point, it is clear from the epigraphic documents that Indrayudha was eventually defeated by Dharmapala, who replaced him with Chakrayudha. Due to this latter clear historical hostility with Dharmapala, we did not consider it worth mentioning that they may have been possibly once allies. The alliance is a speculation in any case based on the fact that Dhruva conquered a lot of North India, which Indrayudha would have been in charge of, and in the same war defeated Dharmapala. We did not consider the evidence of an alliance based on these facts to be convincing. Though we know that Vatsaraja would have messed Dharmapala up good before he gets attacked by Dhruva from the south, we don't know the extent of damage to Dharmapala's kingdom. After defeating Dharmapala somewhere in the Doab, it just seems that Vatsaraja kept chasing Dharmapala down the east of India and Dharmapala kept retreating eastwards until Vatsaraja himself got wrecked by Dhruva. It could have been the case that Dharmapala was retreating to mass his forces somewhere in Bengal for a counteroffensive, though it's a moot point as Dharmapala also gets demolished in his next battle, which is with Dhruva. After Dhruva has his go at taking a dump on Dharmapala, it's not explained why he doesn't stay in North India to consolidate his victory and solidify his extended borders. It appears that Dhruva may have had no interest in that and merely wanted to go for a raid. In any case, the video mentions that Dhruva's supply lines and resources would have taken a toll if he did want to conquer all of the subcontinent, which is likely to have been the case. Following Dhruva's return, though it is clear that Dharmapala reconquers his lost territories and takes the fight to Indrayudha, it is unclear how he would have had the manpower to take Kannauj after being demolished by Vatsaraja and Dhruva. In the video, we explain that Indrayudha would have been divided in his ranks due to the defection of his brother Chakrayudha. The explanation is a solid one, but the historical documents don't actually mention how much of a role Chakrayudha had to play, nor does it identify him as Indrayudha's brother. In the hindsight of him being chosen as Dharmapala's protege to rule over Kannauj, we thought it would make sense to give him an active role to play in the siege of Kannauj to deserve his position under Dharmapala. At this time, we provide in the video that the expansion and dominance of the Pala Empire over northern India discouraged Jayapida from leaving for another conquest. However, in the Raja Tarangini, there is no mention of the Pala Empire or the state of India at the time Jayapida abandoned his hopes and dreams. The Raja Tarangini only mentions the discovery of large copper reserves in Jayapida's kingdom as what ultimately distracted Jayapida from his quest for glory. Still, considering the approximate chronology of Jayapida's demise into evil and the establishment of Dharmapala's empire, we thought it would have been a likely factor in convincing Jayapida to focus on domestic affairs. This is especially so considering Jayapida's previous enthusiasm for conquest when northern India was likely more divided and weaker. Considering Jayapida's overall character, we thought that Jayapida would have had a strategic military reason to give up on his heroic ambitions instead of just greed. The rise of Dharmapala's next adversary, Vatsaraja's son, Nagbad II, was helped by the attacks of the other kings on the Pala Empire. However, the sources do not clarify the terms of alliances between these kings and how coordinated the strikes were. The video mentions that the strikes were simultaneous and well organized under Nagbad II's leadership, as that made sense to us considering that the Pala Empire was almost demolished in its entirety. Still, there is a conjecture that Dharmapala's dire situation may have been contributed to by another invasion from the north by the king of Tibet at the same time. This conjecture isn't expanded on any further, so we just left it out. Otherwise, we'd have to explain how the king of Tibet would have been fought back to his homelands when it wasn't even established that he launched an invasion during this time in the first place. The reason for the concurrent invasion of Dhruva's son, Govinda III, into Nagbad II's territories is not explained in the sources. Could have been the case that Nagbad II's growing power alarmed Govinda III. Nagbad II did make alliances with states on the border of the Rashtrakuta kingdom and also captured the strongholds of Malav. The state of Malav commanded the route between the Rashtrakuta kingdom and northern India and was also likely a vassal of the Rashtrakuta kingdom. As such, Govinda III had plenty of reason to be nervous. Still, considering the surrounding circumstances of how perfect the timing was, and the voluntary submission of Dharmapala and Chakrayudha at the conclusion of Govinda III's conquest, it seems likely that Dharmapala invited Govinda III to attack Nagbad II. This is the version of events suggested by Ramesh Chandra Majumdar and the one that the video went with. However, there is some dispute whether Govinda III obtained the submission of Dharmapala and Chakrayudha through force. This understanding is based on an inscription of Govinda III, where it is claimed that he defeated Dharmapala and carried away the image of the goddess Tara. While this inscription can indicate that Govinda III militarily humiliated Dharmapala, the wording of the inscription also allows the interpretation that Dharmapala was politically defeated in that he voluntarily submitted to Govinda III and gifted him the image of the goddess Tara. If there was a military campaign against Dharmapala, we would have expected this to have been mentioned. It is also contended by scholars that Govinda III would not have had the time or resources to launch a grand campaign against Dharmapala after he defeated Nagbad II. The Mongir copperplate mentions that Dharmapala marries Rana Devi, the daughter of a Rashtrakuta king named Parabala. However, this king is said to have ruled central India in 861 AD, which is about 50 years after Dharmapala consolidates his power in northern India. The Rashtrakuta monarch at the relevant time would have been Govinda III, as mentioned in the video, which sides with Ramesh Chandra Majumdar's opinion. He opines that instead of a Rashtrakuta monarch, this Parabala may have just been from a well-known Rashtrakuta family. In the video, we place this marriage to have been arranged by Govinda III following his conquest against Nagbad II. This chronology made sense to us considering that if Dharmapala was already married into the Rashtrakutas beforehand, then Nagbad II would have been wise to prepare for an invasion from the south. In light of the amount of damage Govinda III inflicted on Nagbat II, which basically destroyed Nagbat II's entire empire, we considered it safe to assume that Nagbat II did not anticipate the intervention of Govinda III. This is despite the fact that the previous war between the Palas, Pratiharas and Rashtrakutas went the same way. Nagbat II was suspiciously confident in his strategy, a bit too confident if in fact Dharmapala was already married into the Rashtrakutas and the two massive kingdoms were on friendly terms. Accordingly, in the video, we indicate that the friendship between the Palas and Rashtrakutas developed following the war with the Pratiharas, and that Govinda III would have arranged the marriage of Dharmapala with one of the prominent families within his clan. Assuming that back in those days, kings did not simply go on dates with ladies from other kingdoms, we thought that Govinda III would have been the one to arrange this wedding. This friendly relationship between kings may also help explain why there were no further conflicts that emerged between the Palas and Rashtrakutas following the defeat of the Pratiharas, even when the Palas expanded their power to dominate the north. Some scholars argue that it was after the defeat of Nagbat II by the Rashtrakutas that Nagbat II went to war against Dharmapala. This means that Nagbat II would have enjoyed a triumphant victory after a devastating loss. Accordingly, in this scenario, it would have been the Pratiharas, not the Palas or Rashtrakutas, who became the ultimate victors of the tripartite struggle between them for the throne of Kanauj. This is the version of events that Wikipedia sides with. The only evidence in favor of this theory is the suggestion that Nagbat II transferred his capital to Kanauj, which is mentioned in a source which briefly states that the king Nagbat II of Kanauj died around 833 AD. If Nagbat II did move his capital to Kanauj after his defeat by the Rashtrakutas, that would inevitably mean that he ultimately consolidated his empire and dominated the north, not Dharmapala. However, as highlighted by Ramachandra Majumdar, the evidence for Nagbat II's occupation of Kanauj following his war with the Rashtrakutas is weak. First of all, calling him Nagbat II of Kanauj could have been just a way to hype his character up, as Kanauj was a famous capital at the time. Secondly, it is fairly established that Nagbat II chased Chakrayuddha out of Kanauj and did briefly have some power over it, at least before he was attacked by Govinda III, so the source identifying him as Nagbat II of Kanauj could just be alluding to that brief victory. Thirdly, the source has some issues with dates and doesn't appear to be completely accurate in its telling, so it can be doubted in its account that Nagbat II moved his capital to Kanauj. Fourthly, as suggested by Ramachandra Majumdar, it could be the case that Nagbat II did eventually have a breakthrough and moved his capital to Kanauj, after attacking Dharmapala and subsequently losing to Govinda III. However, this breakthrough would have been towards the end of Nagbat II's reign and following Dharmapala's death. In any case, his Pratihara empire would soon crumble as Dharmapala's son, Devapala, becomes emperor and basically takes over the Indian subcontinent. This is the version that the video went with, as it seemed the most in harmony with all the other sources. Under Devapala, the Pala empire is believed to have extended across much of northern India. Like his father Dharmapala, Devapala ruled with centralized power in Bengal and Bihar, while other regions acknowledged his authority. There are indications in historical sources which suggest that the empire may have reached as far south as the southernmost tip of the subcontinent. However, some historians regard this as likely the exaggeration of court poets. In any case, we've decided to trust these poets because it makes the map on screen look epic. Thank you for watching this video. If you like this fun map of Bangladesh in the background, please do buy it from the link in the description, as it will help our channel grow. Also, if you enjoyed this video, please don't forget to like, comment, subscribe and share, as it will help us immensely. And if you want to go the extra step, please do support us through our Patreon. Catch you all in our next video.